Good evening, everyone, to another session of Evenings with Steve. My name is Steve Skirka. I'm your host again tonight, and we have a very special program tonight. I just wanted to alert everyone to the chat box that we have to please send your messages to me, Steve Skirka. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as I can, and all I would ask is that you be respectful to our guest. I want to announce our next program is March 16th, 7 o'clock, another Tuesday night. Vivian Berkovich, a columnist and a former Canadian ambassador to Israel. We're going to preview the Israeli election at the end of the month. I also want to tell you about the sponsors and partners for tonight's program. It's sponsored by Beth Sholem Synagogue and UGA Federation of Greater Toronto, and our partners are Adath Israel Congregation, Beth Emet Beis Yehuda Synagogue, Beth Radon Congregation, Beth Raim Synagogue, Beth Tikva Synagogue, Beth Torah Congregation, Beth Tzedek Congregation, B'nai B'rith Canada, Congregation Habonim, the First Nara Yever Congregation, the Jewish National Fund of Canada, Kilat Beth Israel of Ottawa, Pride of Israel Synagogue, Sherei Tzion Congregation of Montreal, and finally Stand With Us Canada. Incredible representation from the Jewish community in Toronto, Canada, Montreal, and Ottawa. Just on a personal note, I wanted to mention that my debut novel, Pharaoh and the Clever Assassin, will be launched and released on May 5th in Canada and the United States. It's a book of historical fiction, a legal thriller. It's set at the Buffalo World's Fair in 1901. So now let's get to our guest tonight, and it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, and we're thrilled to have him tonight, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, formerly Wall Street Journal, actually originally Jerusalem Post, now a columnist at the New York Times. His columns are read by everyone. And I want to introduce you, Bret. Bret Stephens. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're thrilled to have you.
Well, it's a pleasure. I wish I were with you in person. I miss being in Toronto, which is one of my favorite cities. And I'm slightly intimidated by preceding my friend Vivian, who I think is going to be a terrific show for all of you. Steve, are you there?
Looks like Steve just needs a minute to reset his internet. So if everyone can just be patient, and we'll give Steve a minute, and I'm sure he'll be back with us. Thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry I lost the connection, but that's the Zoom technology world that we live in, Bret. So I was just saying that 4.5 years ago, I was in the second row, Beth Sholem, you were speaking. And I was there with my friend Nathan, my wife Randy, and you got up. It was about 1.5 months before the chance of winning. He could win the presidential election. And I can tell you that that was the first time anyone had said that. For me and for many people, that president in 2016. And I remember putting my hand up and asking you a question. And the question was basically that just that day, Trump had been involved in an incident with an NBC reporter, Billy Bush, used some terribly vulgar language against women. And I turned to you and I said, Bret, can he win with that? And you looked at me and you said, yeah, he did win. So now I'm going to turn to the column that you wrote on Sunday with Gail Collins. Here we have Trump speaking at the CPAC conference, and you are quoted in that article as saying to Gail Collins, we may be staring at the worst sequel of all time, the sequel being Donald Trump and presumably another presidency. And so my question is it your view that Donald Trump, A, can win the nomination for the Republican Party in the next presidential election, and can he indeed become president again?
I think the lesson of 2016, Steve, is that we live in an age in which political scenarios that 10 or 15 years ago seemed not just unlikely, but almost surreal or comical, are not just possible, but they are entirely plausible. Now, if I were to place a reasonable bet, I would say that Trump cannot again become president. He will not be the 21st century Grover Cleveland, if that historical reference point makes sense to a Canadian audience. He will not win non-consecutive terms as president. Could he be the party's nominee, however? I think that's not at all unlikely. What is really certain is that at least as of now, he remains at a minimum a kingmaker in the Republican Party, and whoever becomes the nominee, if it is not him, is going to have to make his, or perhaps if it's Nikki Haley, her peace with Trump if they are going to win the nomination from the GOP and then have a united party behind him. So the sequel is a bad one no matter what, because Trump will have a decisive say in who that nominee is going to be and whether that nominee has any hope of success. Now, the other point I want to make, I wrote a column a while back after the election, and when Trump began to deny the legitimacy of the election. This is or of the results. This is in November. And I compared it to what in Germany was called the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, which was this notion that Germany had not, in fact, lost the First World War in the field. It had been stabbed in the back by unscrupulous politicians, and it created some of the mythology, which in turn contributed to the rise of the National Socialist movement in Germany. Those forces, that kind of conspiracy thinking, that sort of political darkness, if you will, is going to gain ground in the United States if Joe Biden does not have a successful presidency. So I say this as someone who has always been on the right side of the political divide, and until 2016 had never voted for a Democratic candidate. I am hoping that Biden has a successful presidency, because I fear the kind of political scenarios that could unfold if his presidency fails.
Is there room for a right of center party, a third party that can replace the current Republican Party, or is Trump the kingmaker going to cancel that out?
So I suspect many people in this audience really understand the American political system probably better than most Americans understand it themselves. Third parties in the United States are face an uphill battle, because the Electoral College kind of creates mechanisms for winner-takes-all politics. And it's why even well-funded third-party candidacies like Ross Perot in 1992 and his movement went nowhere, along with every third party, really dating back to 1860 and the rise of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln. That being said, it's funny that you should ask this question, Steve, because I'm in the midst of drafting a long piece for the Times with a provisional headline, don't hold me to this, that America needs a liberal party. And when I say liberal, I mean it in something like the Australian or the Dutch sense. I mean it in the sense that America needs a right of center party that is nonetheless committed in the broadest philosophical way to core liberal values, right? The belief in an open society, intolerance, in the importance of free speech, pluralism, all of the values that until Trump, the Republican Party more or less subscribed to and has increasingly abandoned. I would add just one more point to that. There's an illiberal movement on the political left as well that has been gaining ground for quite some time. I've written about it repeatedly in the last few weeks. It's called wokeism or certain shades of progressivism. That side of the left is every bit as intolerant and narrow-minded as much of the nativists, or as many of the nativists on the right are.
She says that she loves your chat with Gail Collins. She wants to know if you actually do it back and forth through email or messaging, or do you actually talk to each other face to face? So there's the question for you, Bret.
I appreciate the question. I love the fact that column is so popular. It is, and it's a sleeper at the Times in that on social media, it never goes anywhere, but among Times readers, and we're talking about now 7.5 million or so paid subscribers and many other millions more, it always does remarkably well. Because we have a philosophy that it's a conversation, not an argument, and that we enter as friends and leave as friends and try to learn something from one another and maybe have a laugh or two, as opposed to just scoring points and batting each other over the head. How it's done, I hate to, I wish there were a more romantic story, but we have what's called, I'm sure familiar to most of you, a Google document, which is just a shared document. And usually the way it starts is she'll pitch a lead, or I'll pitch a lead, sorry for using the newspaper jargon, an opening, and just to get the ball rolling. And it's a little bit, the way we see it, it's like a friendly game of tennis in which the point is just to keep the ball in the air and not to care too much if the ball falls slightly outside the line. So we go back and forth on the Google document. Usually takes us, if we did it in time, it would probably take us maybe 2 hours, but half the time she needs to walk her dog, or I have to go give my kid lunch, or something or other, and so it takes the better part of an afternoon, and then we're done, and an editor looks it over and makes a few points. There are always matters of diction and style and all the rest of it, and then it's done, and it's the most enjoyable part of my work week.
All right. So for the month of February, you wrote a very lengthy piece that I read in Commentary Magazine. And the title itself was very interesting, Brad. The title was Memo to President Biden, Please Don't Mess Up the Abraham Accords. And perhaps in answering this next question, you can briefly describe what the Abraham Accords are for the part of our audience who may not be aware of it. But essentially, what was the warning, or what was the request you were making of President Biden on this issue, relating, of course, to the Middle East and Israel?
John Podhoretz, who's the editor of Commentary, originally wanted to title it Memo to Biden, Please Don't Screw Up the Abraham Accords. And I said, no, we can't have that. So we ended up with Mess Up. So what are the Abraham Accords? In the narrowest sense, they are the peace agreements that were struck between the governments of Israel Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates in August and September, in the late summer and fall. More broadly, they refer to the accords that are likely to be struck now between Israel and Morocco, Sudan, if you can believe it, Oman, very likely, and the biggest prize of all, and a very serious possibility, peace and diplomatic relations between Jerusalem and Riyadh, which effectively means, with one or two exceptions, significant exceptions, the end of what for 70 years people have called the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a big deal. And I think, those who read me know that I'm not sympathetic to President Trump, but I think this was a very significant diplomatic accomplishment. It's probably the most significant breakthrough for peace in that region in as long as I can remember, and that goes for the Oslo Accords too. And what's significant about the Abraham Accords isn't simply that it extends the ambit of diplomatic relations between Israel and a couple more or several more Arab countries. It represents, I think, a revolution in thinking about the nature of Arab-Israeli peacemaking. In this particular respect, for 50 years, the conventional wisdom has been that the way peace is going to work for Israel is first it has to make peace with the Palestinians, and once it does that, it can make peace with its neighbors, with the rest of the Arab world. That is to say, peace has to kind of move from the middle of the circle and radiate outwards. What the Abraham Accords do is they decouple the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the Israeli-Arab conflict. And they say, in effect, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict may be some insolvable Gordian knot, but the Israeli-Arab conflict is a solvable conflict. It's a solvable conflict because there aren't territorial issues at stake. There are common interests, particularly when it comes to facing up against the challenge of Iran and Iranian imperialism. And that if you're going to ultimately solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, maybe you should be working from the outside in, which is to say, once the Palestinians notice that Israel has peace with Jordan, Egypt, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, other countries, maybe Palestinians will come to recognize that they are the laggards in the region when it comes to recognizing Israel, not the tip of the spear when it comes to an effort to destroy Israel.
So you wrote something in the article that I found fascinating, and it was just after you described giving Trump his due. You wrote that Trump showed that when U.S. policy is maximally pro-Israel, it did nothing to diminish America's standing with its Arab allies. And that struck me as something that was so counterintuitive and counter to everything that I'd read about American foreign policy regarding Israel in the past. Was that unique and historic an approach, Bret?
Well, it's something I've been saying for a very long time. I mean, notice that the previous great breakthrough in Arab-Israeli relations happened in the 1970s after Richard Nixon had ordered the resupply of Israel and basically saved had Israel's back in the darkest days of the Yom Kippur War. And I think the lesson that Anwar Sadat took from that wasn't that the United States had helped his enemy, that is to say, had helped Israel. It's that the United States was a reliable ally. One of the problems that America has had in the region, and I think more broadly throughout the world in the last many decades, is that the quality or the reliability of being a friend of America has been tested and hasn't always held up. I mean, if you are an Afghan right now, you might be thinking about whether having America as an ally was such a good bargain, just as if you were Vietnamese and wound up as a boat person, you might have had that thought too. So America does best diplomatically when it shows, in the spirit of the United States Marine Corps, that there is no better friend and no fiercer enemy. That has been the effect that America's needed when it has achieved important breakthroughs. And that has been true whether now with the Abraham Accords back in 1973 during the crisis, or even going back to 1947, 48 during the crisis over Berlin.
So you also, in the same article, indicated that you were not optimistic, despite your admonition to Joseph Biden about his direction with respect to Mideast policy. And you noted that his sole idea for the region seemed to be an eagerness to bring America back into the nuclear arms agreement with Iran. Now, you wrote that article before two things happened. The first was the president's decision on February 25th to order airstrikes against targets in Syria as a warning to Iran against backing militias in Iraq. And secondly, the various appointments that have been made, Secretary of State to Foreign Affairs. So I just wanted to know, have those decisions in that event shaped or changed your view of Biden's projected Mideast policy?
Yeah, look, I wrote the article, in fact, at the end of December, because when you write for magazines, there's a fairly long lead time. The magazine appeared in print in February, but it's in the nature of these things that they're written a little earlier. I've been pleasantly surprised, with one or two exceptions, by the Biden administration. I feared that Susan Rice was going to be Secretary of State. I argued vociferously back in the summer against her being chosen as vice president, as the vice presidential pick, and I argued against her back in 2012 when she was being considered by Obama as Secretary of State. So I think Tony Blinken, look, he and I don't agree about everything, but as secretaries of state go, I think he was a reasonably good pick, a person out of a centrist tradition of democratic policymaking, and certainly a friend of Israel. And that was, I think that was heartening. I think the great test for the Biden administration, Steve, is not how it's going to distinguish itself from Trump. Everyone knows that it's going to be different from Trump. The test is how it's going to distinguish itself from Obama, and whether it learned the lesson of Obama's failures. Right. And I noticed that the Biden administration has taken a slightly more cautious approach when it comes to what I think was the fundamentally misbegotten Iran nuclear deal. And now, of course, the Iranians have, in effect, done my position a favor by flatly refusing in the last 24 hours or so to negotiate with the Biden team.
But that would have been foreseeable when Biden ordered the airstrike. So at least is a realistic possibility that it would have that impact on the agreement. I mean, so you'd have to give Biden credit for that too, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, the strike was a very calibrated strike. It was, the president was given a menu of options and he chose the most, I think, the minimalist option. But it was important that he put Iran on notice that, unlike in the Obama years, when Obama went out of his way not to hit Iranian proxies for fear of upsetting his nuclear deal, that Biden demonstrated that he was not afraid to use force. And it suggested, and again, this is just sort of speculative on my part, it suggested that Biden had understood that the JCPOA, that's the term of art for the Iran nuclear deal, had fundamentally failed in one of its core assumptions, which was the idea that if Iran had a nuclear deal, it would moderate its behavior in the region. In fact, what Iran did when it had the nuclear deal was become much more aggressive in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere throughout the region. So it suggested that Biden at least understood that something different had to be, a different America had to present itself if there was going to be a realistic negotiation. The one thing that really concerns me, I'll just add one thing, is the appointment of Rob Malley as the special envoy, the administration's envoy on, or point man on Iran. I think Malley had a record during the Obama years when he was in government of doing more to represent the Iranian position in Washington and present Washington's position to Iran, and that alarms me.
Just before I go to my next question, I should ask you about the Vice President, Kamala Harris. What is your view of her? Are you high on her or not?
Am I high on her? I'm not high on anything, Steve. I just want everyone here to know that. I'm high on Snapple iced tea. No, look,
it's a cultural difference.
I was not. Look, there was a moment in 2020, and I understand why there was why it was important for Biden to choose someone of a different gender and a different race and a different generation, and I get all that. And I again, as I said at the beginning, I wish the Biden administration well. I'm not rooting for it to fail. America can't afford another failed presidency, and I hope Harris grows in office. But she was a really bad candidate. I mean, she washed out before the Iowa caucus was held, or the New Hampshire primary, very, very early on. I don't think she's actually a particularly gifted politician. I think that if Biden steps down in 2024, as I suspect he will, and fails to run for a second term, or abstains from running for a second term, and she's the nominee, she will be a weak candidate. But, again, I say this after she's been in office for all of 5 weeks. So I think people deserve a chance to grow into their respective positions.
Okay. So last Friday, an intelligence report was issued in your country regarding the brutal murder of the Saudi journalist and American resident Jamal Khashoggi. And the report concluded that the Saudi crown prince, his initials are MBS, was responsible for the capture and killing of Khashoggi. It went right to the top. So in the days that have followed since Friday, it appears clear, at least to this point, that President Biden is unwilling to punish MBS for his crime. And that decision has brought both support and condemnation. And the contrast is represented by one of your colleagues, Nicholas Kristof in the Sunday New York Times. He had a column titled, "President Biden Lets a Saudi Murderer Walk." And in our national newspaper today, the Globe and Mail, Canada's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia wrote a column titled, "MBS has a close call with justice." So you couldn't have two more contrasting columns. And the former ambassador wrote that he argues for the US. He doesn't disagree with the president's decision to not punish MBS, but he argues that the US should use its influence in the region to promote Saudi reform efforts and to put MBS on notice that he may not get a second chance. And so I really wanted to know where you stand on this issue, Bret.
Well, look, for the first and most obvious and necessary thing to say is that what happened to Jamal Khashoggi was despicable and evil, and a reminder of what the Saudi regime has long been and in many respects remains. Now, it's also the case that, what does it mean bringing MBS to justice? I mean, what does that actually mean other than words on a page? He is the crown prince and likely the longtime ruler of Saudi Arabia, which is the world's third largest producer of crude oil and is going to be an important player in the region, whether MBS is one sort of person or another. So we have to sort of understand what kind of relationship the United States has and ought to have with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not our friend, but Saudi Arabia is our ally. Just as the Soviet Union was our ally, Canada's as well as America's, in World War II. And foreign policy is unfortunately not a matter of a judicial proceeding. Foreign policy involves weighing core national interests and hoping that where you can inflect those interests with a sense of one's moral values and core beliefs. So, if we were to say tomorrow, MBS, we're not ever going to speak to you again, Saudi Arabia isn't going to go away. The government of Saudi Arabia isn't going to hand over MBS to the court in the Netherlands or Geneva or somewhere else to be put on trial for Khashoggi. We have to deal with this world. About 10 years ago, I became friendly with John McCain in the last years of his life. And about 10 years ago, I was in Munich with him for the Munich Security Conference, in which he said, he called publicly for what I forgot the exact words, but he said, we need a new bargain with our autocratic allies. He called them allies, not friends, right? Which is to say that we're willing to help you, but help has to be twinned with genuine efforts at reform. So are we going to cut Saudi Arabia off from, say, selling them arms? Well, if we were to do that, they would just buy arms from the Chinese or from the Russians or some other unscrupulous country, France maybe, I don't know. That would be self-defeating. But we can sell them arms and at the same time say, this has to go hand in hand with greater transparency and an entirely different approach to the way you think of the world. And one of the things that cannot be done is effectively kidnapping people off the streets of foreign countries, sticking them in your embassies, and chopping them up. So I think what Biden has done, which is to say embarrass MBS, humiliate MBS, but not fundamentally alter our relations, is probably about the right approach. I think what Trump did was let him off far too easily. Biden has sent a signal, but it shouldn't be a signal that leads to a kind of self-defeating policy for the sake of demonstrating our virtue.
I should tell you that our prime minister was asked same question about MBS, and what he said was, he's not our friend, he's someone we do business with. But I just want to ask you a follow-up question on this, and it's the lawyer's propensity to follow up a point, because what you described makes eminent sense. But my question is, if ultimately MBS knows that we're not going to stop doing business with him, Canada and the United States, and even though we speak about the need to reform, and even though we speak about you got to get your ship in order and get everything right, what leverage do we have if ultimately he knows we're never going to stop that relationship?
Well, we have more leverage if we have a relationship. I mean, let's take an example. If Saudi Arabia is, as it is now, flying F-15s, right, as opposed to MiGs, right, those F-15s represent, an investment, a huge investment that you don't simply shut down one day, right? And they need to be serviced and refurbished and they need parts from, I think Boeing is their manufacturer. You have leverage in those ways when you have a relationship. When you simply cut off a country and force it to absolutely recalibrate where it stands in terms of the nature of its alliances, that leverage goes away. And by the way, we also have to remember that in even the best of circumstances, leverage is going to be limited. What can we do with the Saudis? We can hopefully show them that the only path by which they avoid the fate of someone like Muammar Gaddafi or Bashar Assad is through a process of gradual and deliberate but inexorable reform toward a more transparent, accountable, and law-abiding form of government.
So before I leave Saudi Arabia, let me just ask you one further question about the country, and that's the future of the relationship between the state of Israel and Saudi Arabia, because in that article that you wrote in Commentary magazine, you wrote about the importance of solidifying that relationship in the future. What do you see about that?
Well, that would be the big kahuna, as you know, you might say, the big prize. Look, if Israel and Riyadh, if Jerusalem and Riyadh make peace, the Arab-Israeli conflict is over. Over. Yes, Syria, Lebanon, a few countries where there's hostility, but the strategic effects of that are difficult to overstate. For one thing, every crisis, sorry for seeing this through a more American lens than a Canadian one, but every crisis, or many of the major crises in American foreign policy since the 1950s have involved the Arab-Israeli conflict. Over Suez in '56 led to a serious break with our friends in Britain and France. In '73, we went to a nuclear alert over the situation in the Sinai. In '91, over the Scud missile attacks. Time and again, American security interests have been affected by that longstanding animosity between Jerusalem and its neighbors. Take that away, and the United States, and it serves American interests. So America should be making an effort to midwife, if midwife is the wrong term, to serve as a matchmaker between, midwife Saudi-Israeli peace. Second thing is the great competition for the United States in the 21st century, I think it's fairly clear, is not going to happen in the Middle East. It's going to happen in the Far East between the United States and China. If we are going to accomplish that pivot from the Middle East to East Asia, it'll help if that conflict is settled, and if Israel and the Saudis or the Arab world have a much more stable kind of relationship. It doesn't mean that the United States can completely exit the Middle East. It still lifts most of the world's cheap oil and is always going to be significant. But it'll be less significant, and it'll allow us to focus strategically on the place where we need to be, which is probably the South China Sea rather than the Persian Gulf. And final point, Steve, America would be better served if Israel and the Arab world were united in their efforts to contain Iran and prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
So before I turn to my next question, I just want to remind everyone that we do have this chat box, and I'd encourage you to send me any questions as we move into the last third of the program. And Bret, we're going to talk now about cancel culture. And just as a segue to that, I don't know if you're aware of the latest news today, but Dr. Seuss, the publisher of Dr. Seuss, announced that it won't be publishing or republishing 6 of the Dr. Seuss books.
Yeah.
And you wrote a column recently titled Woke Me, W-O-K-E, Woke Me When It's Over. And you write that in the humorless world of woke, the satire is never funny and the statute of limitations never expires, even when it comes to Hamantaschen. So we have an audience of Jewish institutions and synagogues. You wrote about woke and Hamantaschen. So perhaps you can just describe the story that you're referring to when you mentioned Hamantaschen, Bret.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say my 11-year-old makes some terrific Hamantaschen. I'm very proud of her. This is a story that is, on its face, seemingly trivial, but kind of tells you a little bit about what is happening in at least American culture. I'm not totally sure I know how far this extends into Canada. I suspect quite a bit.
Yes.
A few weeks ago, someone on Twitter, someone who keeps a food blog, a young woman, complained on Twitter that she had found in Bon Appetit magazine, which is, as you can imagine, a magazine ostensibly devoted to food, published by Condé Nast, which also publishes Vanity Fair and The New Yorker, that she'd found in Bon Appetit a recipe for Hamantaschen written by a non-Jewish food writer. And the headline was something like, how to make actually good Hamantaschen. Now, those of you who care about grammar might be upset about the grammar of that headline. But this person's objection was the idea that a non-Jewish food writer would implicitly disparage the traditional methods of making Hamantaschen by saying that it needed to be made actually good. Now, if your mind isn't numb with the smallness of this, then something's wrong. Nonetheless, following this person's complaint, Bon Appetit magazine issued this groveling editor's note begging forgiveness for insulting Jewish food traditions. And as part of what it called, in a very Orwellian sense, its archive repair project, it was going to erase the offending headline and rewrite the article so as not to insult Jewish food traditions. Now, I have ancestors who were distinguished rabbis in Vilna, and I think I have the standing to say that no actual Jews were offended by a headline called "How to Make Actually Good Hamantaschen." But Bon Appetit magazine needed not only to apologize for this, but to erase the past. Those of you who are readers of 1984 may remember that Winston Smith, the hero of 1984, spends his days at the Ministry of Truth erasing past history in order to create a fiction that is always convenient to Big Brother, to the people of power. And so this little story, Steve, gives you a sense of what we talk about when we talk about woke culture, which is an attempt to make everything in our culture politically correct, including things that had happened in our past. For example, Dr. Seuss's early cartoon efforts from, I guess, the 1930s and the 1940s, which had caricatures that now strike some people as offensive. I think this is scary in its implications. We cannot understand progress unless we understand what the past was about. And we cannot judge the moral standards of the past through the lens of the present. It simply doesn't work that way. Many people in our past have views that today we would consider unpleasant or incorrect or something or other, but we have to judge them by the standards of our time, at least if we want to be judged by some future generation, by the standards of our own time. I'm sure that in 100 years, people will think it's absolutely barbaric that every year we slaughtered millions of cows in order to feed ourselves protein, because they will have found a better way of providing protein to billions of people. But that, I don't think, makes us all barbarians or butchers just because we aren't meeting that standard. So there is an effort afoot in American culture, and I think to some extent in Canadian culture, that is more than just an effort to reform. It's an effort to erase. And if you know anything about the history of the totalitarian eras of the Soviet Union or even revolutionary France or Pol Pot, they always have a year zero connected to them. And they always end up with people's backs to the wall or their heads under guillotines. It's something we should be very cautious about. So that was a long answer to your question, but
Right.
it gives you a sense of how this is infiltrated into something as ridiculous as a Hamantaschen recipe.
But it's amplified. The problem's amplified, isn't it, because of social media? Because essentially everything we do on social media is now a fingerprint. And a fingerprint.
Right. I think social media should be called anti-social media, because it makes people, it brings out the worst in people, for starters. Secondly, I think you put it very well. It means that everything we have ever said and done that at least is digitally accessible can and will be used against us, at least in the court of public opinion, to borrow the line from the Miranda rulings in the United States. And it means that the tools of social media can be used not just to communicate, but also to distort. One could take a snippet from what I have said in the last 45 minutes here and make me sound as if I'm saying something that I'm not saying. And what's the old expression? Lies move halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And those of us who I think have been in public life have really come to understand just what an ugly tool social media can be. Now, there's a wonderful passage in one of the Socratic, I just lost Steve, but in one of the Socratic dialogues about the misuses of technology or the unintended consequences of technology. And this is where we are today. I guess while we wait for Steve to come back, I should welcome you to my study and apologize for its untidiness. And if any of you are wondering about that rifle that's just over my head, rest assured, I don't think it's been fired in about 170 years, but I live in a very old home, and this is just a piece of its history. It actually has a stamp on it that says Harper's Ferry 1812. So it was used in the War of 1812. I'm afraid now that I think about it, it might have been used against you guys for all that the United States was up to in that war. So I'm offering you my apologies for whatever that rifle did.
Okay. So I wanted to, and can you hear me, Bret? Can I just make
now
sure?
I hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I wanted to turn to the issue of US relations. So you can see we're staying very topical and very contemporary, and we're dealing with events that have happened in the last couple of weeks. But we had this virtual bilateral summit, and you say that, and it sounds so natural, but it's a creature of the COVID era, a virtual bilateral summit between President Biden and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And I believe it was your president's first virtual summit with a world leader. So that was significant. And of course, your previous president, President Trump, had disparaged, insulted, humiliated our prime minister. And to our prime minister's credit, he had stoically resisted taking shots back. And so there was no doubt world leaders. But other than, this feel-good meeting between the two of them, and indeed in a concrete way, President Biden's support for the two Canadians who were arrested and detained in China unjustly, he came out very strongly in support of the prime minister's position. But other than that, is there really any significant difference, if anything of substance, that was accomplished or will be accomplished as we move forward in terms of the relationship between America and Canada moving forward, starting with the fact we know the Keystone deal is canceled. So we already start with that black mark against our country.
Well, I think that's a great shame. I mean, I think the debate over the Keystone pipeline became almost a theological debate rather than a practical one. I mean, Canada is still going to export oil. I don't quite understand the thinking that goes into imagining that Canada can't simply build pipelines or put oil on trains going east as well as west to whether it's, I guess, Halifax or somewhere in British Columbia, and exporting the oil that way in ways that are probably more carbon intensive. And I mean, I remember 7 or 8 years ago, this horrific explosion in somewhere in Quebec of a train, of a fuel-laden train, which I think wiped out half of a town out there. So why that's better than Keystone, I don't quite understand. But you know, this has become almost a religious matter here in the United States, and I think it's a bad way to start the relationship. Look, I'm glad that President Biden understands that America lives in a neighborhood, and we need to get and have the best possible relations with our neighbors south as well as north. I don't think that's something that President Trump understood. You know, at the same time, that also means that the United States ought to be sensitive to Canadian interests, and Keystone was, you know, Keystone was one of them. So what can I say? We'll see how the policy goes. I mean, I was tempted to joke, and this will be funny to some of the people watching this and not funny to others. So I was tempted to joke when Mr. Trudeau said something like, you know, we've missed American leadership on the world stage for the last 4 years. I was tempted to say, well, we've missed Canadian leadership on the world stage for the last 5 or 6 years. But I was fond of Prime Minister Harper, and now you know my biases in terms of Canadian politics.
Yeah. Well, yeah, certainly Prime Minister Harper was very popular for his vociferous and consistent support of the state of Israel. And you should know that we had on this program a previous guest, John Baird, who is the foreign minister, who worked closely with Prime Minister Harper. And you know, let me tie that into my next question, because when I had the former foreign minister John Baird on, when we were talking about the January 6th insurrection, he said to me, you know, Steve, when I was the foreign minister, and he was foreign minister at the time that President Obama was president, so it wasn't that long ago, he said, we didn't just not have the presence of white supremacists, we just didn't have it as on our radar. It wasn't even a problem. And so, you know, when he looked at what's happened, and it's in our country too. The Proud Boys are a terrorist group. We declare them in our country. And I just want to ask you about the rise of white supremacy. Is this something that's an aberration, or is it something that's still under President Biden going to be emerging as a problem we have to contend with?
Well, this is another phenomenon of social media. I'm not sure that there are more white supremacists today than there were, say, 10 years ago. It's that they are able to find one another, right? And they are able to propagate conspiracy theories over chat rooms that, you know, at least 20 years ago simply wasn't possible. I think it's a very serious problem, and it comes not only from the rise of so-called populism, but from declining standards of rationality and reasonableness in Western societies. The United States, Canada. I mean, look, in France, you had the National Front, whose founder was a Holocaust denier. That party came in second in the last elections against President Macron back in 2017. So this is a, you know, a serious and worrisome thing. I think that today the real political divide in the West, Steve, is no longer between conservatives and liberals, at least as most of us know those terms. It's between liberals and illiberals. It's between people who believe in the concept of liberal democracy and everything that goes with it, including respect for democratic processes, respect for the rights of the political and civic rights of your opponents, and the new illiberals, whether they are the wokesters of the left who want to shut down speech, or whether they're the Proud Boys of the right who want to shut down elections. And, it behooves us, I think, especially as Jews, to know that these sorts of dangers are never just coming from one side. They often come from both. And we can't afford not to pay attention, or to pay attention only to one side because we're on the right and we want to look at, the illiberalism of the left, or because we're on the left and want to look at the illiberalism on the right. You have to pay attention to both. This is a really serious problem, and it has antecedents in previous collapses of the liberal democratic order. Earlier in this hour, Steve, I mentioned Weimar. But that's something we ought to bear in mind. I don't think any Jew can afford to look away from the lessons of the Weimar Republic. I recently finished, I have it over there on my bookshelf, Amos Elon's book, The Pity of It All, The History of German Jews, which is a marvelous book. And its last chapter on Weimar is just heartbreaking. And those are the sorts of lessons that we ought to be attentive to, whether it's in Toronto or here in New York, if we're going to have a flourishing Jewish communities moving forward. Because the first 20 or 21 years of the 21st century have not been good ones for the West. And someone needs to stand up and say, we need to steer a different course.
So there's a question in the chat box, and I'm going to expand on it. The question is, will Mitch McConnell be able to pull the radicals in his party in line? And I'm going to expand it to also ask you if President Biden is going to be able to pull the progressives, the left part of his party, in line as well. So what would your answer to that be, Bret?
Well, maybe, because you've got a 50-50 split that in important respects is not really a 50-50 split. That is to say that in the person of Joe Manchin, the senator senior senator from West Virginia, you have a guy who on core issues parts company with President Biden. I mean, he's in a state that went overwhelmingly for President Trump in 2016 and in 2020. And he just represents a different side of the Democratic Party, which means that the political sweet spot for both Mr. Biden and Mr. McConnell is actually somewhere in the center. That can potentially be productive if Biden and McConnell play their cards well. I think Biden could actually afford to see a few pieces of progressive legislation go down in flames, like the $15 minimum wage as an example, or an attempt to destroy the filibuster, in order to say to his party, if we want to get something done, we have to pick policy arguments that can win over the moderate Republicans. Mitt Romney from Utah, Susan Collins from Maine, Ben Sass from Nebraska. And so that means policies like infrastructure, immigration reform, US policy vis-a-vis China and Russia and even the Middle East. And that might make for a successful presidency. You know, we've had these very red or very blue presidencies in the form of President Bush, President Obama, President Trump. We really could use a bit of a purple period in American politics where the concerns of middle of the road voters dominate the agenda.
Okay. So here's my final question for you. I'm going to try to end out on a high note, the high word being a Canadian expression, Bret. So the question is this. I asked John Baird, how important is it to have a strong America? And he expressed how critical it was, vital it was that America take a prominent position on the world stage. And my question to you is, if we accept the damage, the corrosion that was done the past 4 years under the previous president's leadership, culminating in those scenes that played out on January 6th at the Capitol building, almost like a climax before he left office. Can America ever become that beacon on the hill? Can it retain or restore its position as the world leader we once knew it to be?
Well, I hope so. Look, America is always going to have a dominant place because of our size, our geographic location, and what's, in many ways very deeply inscribed in our DNA as a country that sees itself as the last best hope of Earth, to use Lincoln's famous phrase. That being said, great powers sometimes cease to be great powers because they talk themselves out of the role. And I fear that that's a possibility for the United States, as well. The last time we talked ourselves out of the role of being the world's leading democratic power was in 1919 when we failed, or 1920 when we failed to make good on the promises of Versailles, and we left Europe to its devices and brought on the greatest catastrophe in human history, the Second World War. And it would be terrible to have to learn that lesson, to be forced to learn that lesson again. If it's not the United States, the alternatives aren't some self-organizing world order, done according to the tastes and desires of the New Zealands of the world. It will be a brutal and active competition for power among aggressive dictatorships like China, Russia, Iran, and others. So the United States has to recognize that there is no alternative to American power. There is no alternative to American leadership. And the only way in which America can lead is to lead by example, by championing the values we supposedly hold dear, but by doing so with a sense of the world in which we actually live, not some fantasy world that we would like, we would wish to be. So I don't think that's out of the question. But I know I'm supposed to end on a high note. I'm not the world's most optimistic guy these days, and so my fingers remain, at least figuratively, permanently crossed. Have I lost you again, Steve?
Okay, well, that's still hopeful enough for me, Bret. So just before I thank you, I just want to mention that of the COVID-19 program tomorrow, Israel's rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, 7:30 p.m. And if you can join us, that'd be great. And Bret, I wanted to thank you so much for your illuminating, insightful, and brilliance. And from everyone who watched, only I get to thank you, but I know I'm speaking on the behalf of the entire audience.
Well, I want to thank this audience, and I actually want to say the Canadian Jewish community, and in particular the Toronto Jewish community, is, and I say this having spoken all over the place, it really is probably the most vibrant, cohesive, and interesting in North America. And I always treasure my visits to Toronto. And so let's hope that in the fall or this next spring, I'll be with you in person. And again, thank you for the honor of having me.